What a pleasure to be here today with my dear friends Jürgen, Per Espen, in particular. We have been working on this incredible project, which you've now been hearing about for the last almost 2 years. And yes, the key question is, how do we build a movement? As was just indicated, I am the co-president of the Club of Rome. And as Jürgen probably said, this is the 50th anniversary. So he's starting to think, and in fact, I think he's thought about it for quite some time, how the hell did we get here? Why is it that no one actually truly listened? Because yes, some people did, and we are gathering testimonials of the way in which the limits to growth has influenced people's lives. Even politicians who are not really implementing what we warned about. But the fact of the matter is, did we create a movement? Would we be in the midst of a series of tipping points today if we had? And of course, if we're going to be true to ourselves, we would say no. Hence why we started this journey. Hence why we prepared for the risk, the deepening risk of collapse. And I apologize to those of you who are students here because climate anxiety is very real. And we do know that many of you are living it on a day-to-day basis, but so are we. And part of that is, how is it possible that in 1972, the quote that I have here that explains the important challenge for the generation of that time, Jürgen's generation, can still be said texto today and be relevant? That is the key question. How is it that now all those predictions where we saw the interrelationships between population growth, between consumption, with the planetary boundaries and going beyond the planetary boundaries, how is it possible that all of those predictions where we would start to see through the scenarios collapse, tipping points in the 2020s actually are happening today? Because those interconnected global instabilities is what we're now living. And the fact that actually systems change and systems thinking is still not fully integrated into the way in which our governments work, into the way in which all of our sectors are working together, is how we can see the Ukrainian crisis has an impact both on food and energy at the same time, and yet policymakers are still looking at them separately. That fertilizers are the connecting piece, and yet still we're not thinking about how the interconnections means that actually we're truly dependent on certain types of monocrops, certain types of energy sources that we shouldn't be, and we've already known for many, many years that we shouldn't be, and yet we continue to be. These interconnected global instabilities are why we have come back to this year putting out Earth4All as a way to demonstrate how we can shift from the contextual piece that we are in today into a brighter future. What does that look like, and how do we bring more people on the journey? And how do we show them that actually this is a positive journey, not just about sacrifice? For me, the most exciting part of the journey that we've been on together as scientists, economists, modelers, campaigners, is the fact that we were able to bring the system dynamic modeling and the scientists together alongside a transformational economics commission, which stress tested some of the results, created that discussion, which, as Per Espen so clearly pointed to, was hard. Because complexity is hard. Because yes, the poor are those that are suffering. And yes, just giving money to those governments won't necessarily solve everything. And yet, we know that they are most of the world. And somehow we have to figure it out pretty damn fast. That was the beauty of what we've been able to do together. To not always agree, to unpack the differences, to unpack the tensions, to think through how is it can we do this, because this is the decade of action. So bringing together that network and ensuring that we could then start to really focus on well-being was the core, but also something that was really unique and that's different actually from 50 years ago. And that is that the body of thought in economics, new economics, has shifted. That actually what people and economists like Kate Raworth or Tim Jackson or Jürgen himself or others have said is there is not just one way. There is not just one model. The fact of the matter is that somehow we have to think through what is our key value proposition and allow for different models to coexist as long as we come to the same endpoint, as long as we take into consideration social and environmental impacts, as long as we look at the way in which we bring different indicators together, as long as we ensure that we look at public goods and socialize the rewards of environmental and social commons, that we deeply understand inequality, that we deeply understand poverty, and that we deeply understand empowerment, which, by the way, doesn't just mean the agency of women, but brings in the diversity that we all know we need in order to thrive in our societies. What does that look like? And the beauty of this, once again, is that at least everyone that came together didn't just have one theory of change. They didn't all unite, because we're not all united, but they did unite around one thing, and that is we have to change and we have to figure this out. So together, we understood that we needed these 5 turnarounds. Together, we understood that actually you cannot get there unless you have these 5 turnarounds, and that they have to work together. And that if we truly want to unpack the food system and the energy system and ensure that we have access across the globe to both, in the midst of crisis, that we need to solve the empowerment, poverty, and the equality issues. So these 5 turnarounds that you've already been shown are key. And then the question becomes, how do we sell this to a broader audience? Now, one way, as Per Espen just brought you through, and I heard the chuckles, is to do the storytelling. Because that's also the importance of this book and the importance of the reflection of the Club of Rome and all of us who were in the room or the Zoom space, because we've done this through COVID, together, which is we cannot just have another publication that's going to sit on a shelf. We cannot, and by the way, sitting on these expert groups in the European Union, realizing that it doesn't matter how much scientific data you have, look at the taxonomy, which pisses me off, that we can come up after 2.5 years with recommendations that were scientifically based with all the analysis, and the politics come in and you got gas and nuclear that are seen as green. That is the reality. So, do we want to just publish a bunch of data? Is that going to change people's minds? Has the Ipcc done the trick? No, it just creates climate anxiety, but no one else knows really what the hell to do, and those that do know what the hell to do don't want to do it because they might be politically liable. We need to figure out another discourse. That's why this book, we hope, will be different. It gives the storytelling, it brings in different approaches, but most importantly, it looks at implementation. It's not just another book that's going to gather dust, I hope, we hope. It's actually a book that's going to show us how can we actually get this done in the midst of short-term chaos, which, by the way, the conversation that Jürgen and the rest of us had last week in talking to the European Commission is, how do we continue to move forward with the European Green Deal when we have to think about rationing? That's the reality. What do we do? Because we have to think about the support of national policymakers when they are in knee-jerk reaction with regard to the Ukraine, with regard to COVID, and with regard to climate effects. How do we bring in the international agenda? How do we go into the negotiations at the multilateral level and ensure that we hold governments accountable for the $100 billion, for example, that they haven't given to the most vulnerable states, which they promised already in Paris many years ago. How do we ensure that we engage and bring in influencers? Because this has to be Cambridge Analytica for good. We cannot be naive and think that everyone thinks like us. We have to use everything in our toolbox, all the people that can actually support this so we can get something done. How do we ensure that we hold citizen assemblies and bring more citizens together? Because that is a key tool in the toolbox, and then create the media content and the engagement. That is what we've been thinking of. So we've got to look at what our key outcomes are. And what we've tried to do is structure the way in which we use the narrative, the way in which we then affect policy, and then how do we get into the mindset shift? Because that is fundamental. And that is what has not happened in the last 50 years. The way in which we've been looking at prioritization is that we want to focus on core countries. We want to help those countries that actually are already starting to think in this way. The European Union, for example, has several different bits of legislation on well-being. We'll be participating in a series of different conferences with parliamentarians and others to ensure that we unpack what does that mean in practice. We know that we already have countries that are the well-being countries that are struggling. We need to make sure that they are strong because they are our proof points. If they collapse, then our narrative collapses. And for the moment, they have pushback. So how can we enable them? Then how do we bring more countries on board in order to create a groundswell? Because here is the reality. The reality is that the well-being economies did better during COVID than other economies. Why? Because they created the buffers in ensuring that they were looking not just at growth, but at environmental and social indicators. Because actually they also used communication as a way to explain to citizens what was going to happen and that their grief was being shared. These are perfect examples of why a well-being economy is a good thing in times of crisis, and we're going to have more of them. Because also environmental, social, and governance, so ESG principles, those companies that actually integrated ESG principles came out stronger through COVID than others. And funds tripled during COVID. These are our proof points. So not only read the book, for God's sakes, and understand the messages, but look outside and don't tell me that the economy we're living right now is stress-proof and is working. It is those that have actually started to build in the buffers that we're talking about that are actually thriving. So we need, through the Transformative Economics Commission and that stress tank, through our system dynamic model, through our alliances, to build a wider stakeholder movement. And what we hope to do is spark that global conversation and do it in a variety of ways, through the citizen assemblies, as I indicated, by bringing in different nation states, by working with local governments, and by also creating a groundswell at the international level at different moments in time, intervention points like Stockholm Plus 50, like the COPs, to hold governments accountable, but also remind them, stop the siloed thinking. Understand that if you optimize systems, if you look at the win-wins in the solutions, if you bring in the universal basic dividend and the citizen fund, which answers the questions of the last speaker, then actually we can get there. So what would be the public campaign? One is to ensure that we create that debate in all of those different key intervention points. And in fact, I'm drafting right now a statement on behalf of Earth4All that will be launched at Stockholm Plus 50, building on a series of other statements, by the way, that have been made by the G20, by the G7, and by many other high ambition countries around nature, around ensuring that we get rid of fossil energy subsidies and agriculture subsidies. I mean, the G20 have been promising this for the last 10 years, and they gave a date of 2020, and we're nowhere. Part of this is holding nation states and governments accountable for declarations that they have made and have never come to fruition. Most of what we need is actually on the table. It's a question of having the courage to finally put it in place. At a time, I admit, which is difficult because we've just had a COVID crisis, we now have a Ukrainian crisis, and we know that we're going to have an economic backlash. So how do we do this? How do we ensure that we get those national campaigns, that we work with the right people, that we bring everyone together to get excited and enthused around this incredible proposition, which is not just, we have no fucking choice, excuse my language, but this is about a better future. This is about actually reducing the amount of mental illness that we are seeing, the high points of suicide that we are seeing in our youth. The fact that actually maybe the next generation will be better off than the last generation, which is not the point right now, because they are now in a state of well-being. Those are the points that we need to make, and I'm almost finished. Part of this is making sure that we bring individuals on board, and how we do that. It's also, how do we explode through social media? How do we use the tools that we have? As I said, Cambridge Analytica for good, social media on steroids for good, whatever we want to call it. We need young people. We need brilliant people that are now working in the IT sector, etc., that start to come together and coalesce around this campaign. And we will use all of the media outlets that we have in order to do that, including gaming, simulators, to bring more people on the journey. And I'll close, sorry it's not showing, but I know the team can put it on, with this little movie that kind of summarizes what we're trying to do. Thank you.